Well, welcome to part 2 on the U.S. military in Sonoma, California, 1847 to 1851. So part 2 is the regular army, the professional army, comes to Sonoma. So the topics I'm going to talk about in this presentation is why the regular army was needed, a little bit about regulars versus volunteers, who were they, their arrival in Sonoma, the Clear Lake Massacre, the headquarters of the Pacific Division, which was also in Sonoma, and then notable officers posted in Sonoma. So why was the regular army needed? Well, between 1846 and 1848, 815,000 square miles of new land was added. This included the Oregon country, which was added with the Treaty of Oregon in 1846, and then the northern Mexican provinces of Alta California and New Mexico were added following the end of the Mexican-American War and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1846. So there's all this new land. So in 1848, the 1st New York Volunteers were disbanded. So this was the topic of part 1. This was a volunteer regiment that had about 750 soldiers that would spread out throughout California, including Company C in Sonoma. When they disbanded, there was only 129 regular U.S. Army soldiers in California, and only 50 were fit for duty at that time due to sickness, furlough, and so forth. There was also pressure on this number because of desertions. So desertions have always been a problem in the antebellum U.S. Army, roughly about 16% annual rate. But this being gold country, it was especially problematic as soldiers were ready to go. There was also service expiration. So as a soldier's enlistment end, which was a 5-year enlistment, they were free to go on that day wherever they were. So this number was kind of just shrinking. And why was there a very small army? Well, first of all, there's just an inherent distrust in a large professional army. This stems back from the Revolutionary War, and you have to think about what was America in the antebellum period, the period before the Civil War. It was still a confederation of states, in which states had incredible power, individual states, and the federal government had originally been pretty weak. It was growing in strength a little bit. So if you have a large standing army, that by definition would give the central government a lot more power, and this just wasn't wanted. The other thing is there was just a very small federal budget. So during the antebellum time, about 85% of the annual federal budget, or the revenues, were derived from customs duties. There were a few small excise taxes, but not much. So because there was just very minimal money to spend, the Army, and also there was the Navy, got a small share of that. So that also kept the Army pretty small. And it also took a long time to recruit, train, and transport soldiers, especially if they're mounted. They took additional training compared to infantry. And again, to recruit them, train them, and then ship them to the West. So if they were coming from probably like Fort Leavenworth or Carlisle Barracks, it's still anywhere from a 5 to 6 month journey to get across the country or around Cape Horn. So in 1849, we also had the gold rush. And with the gold rush, there's a dramatic population increase. And this represented the largest mass migration in U.S. history. So there was a significant part of the U.S. population that was east of the Mississippi now shifted west. Just looking at California's population, between 1850 and 1852, there was a 181% increase in the population. It was actually much higher compared to 1848, 1849, but the numbers from that period are just not as good. But suffice it to say, it was a dramatic increase compared to that 1849. So in 1849, you have to look at the gold mining aspect of the gold rush. So these are the two principal areas, the Sierra Nevada gold fields in the Northern California goldfields. So previously, and what I'm referring to is the indigenous peoples, the increased conflict. So for the most part, the indigenous people had been pushed away from the coast, at least from Bodega Bay, that area down, and along where all the missions were as well. But this particular area where the gold mines were was a relatively peaceful and safe area for indigenous people. But once these gold mines opened up, then you had a massive rush of miners and settlers and merchants who were just interested in getting anyone in their way out. And so you saw pushing them out, killings and so forth. So you had increased conflicts for sure. There was also no government. That is, there was, and part of this is the standard trajectory for a new land in the West would be for, once it reached a certain population threshold, it could become a U.S. territory. In that case, there then would be a governor appointed, territorial legislature, territorial court system, and then they could meet the next threshold, the next step, and apply for admittance to be a state. With California, this just didn't happen for a couple reasons. One, it happened so fast. With the gold rush of 1849, they blew right past the threshold for territorial. And so all of a sudden, at one point they didn't have, they had minimal need for a government, and then they had a dramatic need. The other thing, it was also controversial to assign or put California on this trajectory because, again, the antebellum period is characterized by the dividing issue of slavery versus free states. And there was concern that most of the states in the Southwest could become slave states. So that they had to tread carefully to keep that balance. This is Congress, keep the balance between slave and free states. This also means thus there was no legislative body, there was no courts, there was no law enforcement, no postal service, uncontrolled immigration. Basically, anyone could go in and enter predominantly San Francisco and head to the gold fields. There was no restriction, there was no naturalization, there was no immigration control. And so the army was needed to be a constabulary force. One is to enforce basic laws as they could, but also to protect settlers and miners from attacks from the indigenous. Also to prevent invasion. So California geographically is detached from the East Coast. Physically, it's far on the other coast, and it's a 6-month overland or 6-month around Cape Horn trip. Very minimal, very small army. Gold was there, and the British and the French were going around the world gobbling up countries or lands. So there was a legitimate concern that California may be vulnerable to potential invasion and conquering. So the army became the government. And if you look at the graph down here, this was the new administrative structure for the West Coast, and it was vested in something called the Pacific Division. And I'll talk about this in a little bit in more detail. Under the Pacific Division, there was 2 departments. These were new departments. One was California, and this was Alta California, much larger than current California borders, as well as Department 11 for Oregon. So the decision was that whoever commanded Department 10 was also going to be the military governor, which in essence was the governor of California until either it got territorial status or state status. So what are some of the difference between regulars and volunteers? So again, part 1 talked about the volunteers that were in Sonoma, and they here are being replaced by the regulars. So a volunteer would only enlist during times of war. This was part of the well-regulated militia model in which there would be some basic training within state militias. In times of war, they could be called upon to fill out or add to the army to perform national defense or whatever the mission was. So enlistment for a regular soldier was 5 years. For a volunteer, it was generally 1 year or the duration of the war, whichever ended first. And as I mentioned in part 1, the New York Volunteers, it was different. There was no time and had to be for the duration of the war because they were the regiment designed to conquer, occupy, and then colonize California. Officers, they were all appointed in regular army. Volunteer, some of the high-level commanders were appointed, but quite often the subalterns, the lieutenants, were elected by the soldiers. Why enlist? Well, generally the primary, not the exclusive, but the primary motivating factor for regular enlisted soldiers was economics. Whereas volunteers, it was predominantly patriotism. Discipline was very strict with regulars. It really depended on who the commander was, but it tended to be looser with volunteers because it was more of a democratic organization. Public reception of enlisted soldiers during the antebellum period was very negative against regular, the professional soldiers, and that was because they enlisted because of economics. Whereas for volunteers, public perception was very positive because patriotism was viewed as their primary factor and to help protect the U.S. So there was no army in Sonoma since August 1848, and that was when the first New York Volunteers finally left and were eventually mustered out and disbanded. May 4th, 1849, Company C of the 1st Dragoons arrived in Sonoma. These were the elite soldiers of the U.S. Army. They were very hardened professional soldiers, as I'll show you and demonstrate. Between 1849 and 1852, there were 133 soldiers and 35 officers in total that served or were posted in Sonoma. This is in addition to the New York Volunteers, which was about 72 soldiers from 1847 to 1848. So Sonoma was also called Camp Sonoma, occasionally Fort Sonoma, the Sonoma Barracks. And as I'll explain, Sonoma, which was separate from the barracks, became the Pacific headquarters for the Army's new Pacific Division. So these are the Army units that were stationed in Sonoma between 1849 and 1852. Company C, 1st Dragoons. This was their base, their home base, and they were here for the entire period, leaving in January 1852. We have other units as well. Company A, 1st Dragoons, and Company E, 1st Dragoons, were here towards the end, getting ready to pretty much head up to Oregon. Company K, 2nd Dragoons, and Company C, Mounted Rifles, were here. So the Dragoons were considered a light cavalry, and they were trained to fight as mounted soldiers, but also to dismount and fight on foot. The 1st Dragoons, in the beginning of the Civil War, would become the 1st Cavalry. The 2nd Dragoons would become the 2nd U.S. Cavalry. Mounted Rifles was, at this point, a relatively new type of unit. They were different in that they were mounted, but their focus was to ride to a battle or a fight, dismount, and fight on foot. So it was sort of a rapid response to get there and to fight. Now, Dragoons, the difference is they had carbines, which were short, so they could use them on horseback, whereas the Mounted Rifles had rifles for their primary armament. There are two gaps here. One is when the garrison emptied out for the Clear Lake expedition, and then another time they emptied out to go to Oregon to deal with indigenous conflicts. And when they emptied out, there was no one at the Sonoma Barracks. except the Pacific Division, which was separate. Now this graph just shows the total force, which was how many soldiers were at the barracks. These are based on end of month reports, so you can have fluctuation within each month. And the dark blue is soldiers that were active. They were, ready for duty, mission ready. The gold, they were on sick call, so they weren't able to. And blue, they were confined. It meant they did something, either disobeyed orders, or occasionally if they deserted, something like that, they would be confined. Now what this doesn't show is those who are on furlough. So if you look at May 1849, the number is only 23, which is a lot smaller than the force that arrived there. The reason being is soldiers were given fairly liberal furloughs. And the strategy here, the command structure, not just locally, was to give soldiers long furloughs, 2 to 3 month furloughs. Because the thought was, because you're in the gold fields, desertions are a huge problem. If you let them go out into the gold fields, try their luck. If they're successful, great. If not, they'll learn pretty quick. They'll come back and they won't desert. So that was one of the strategies for the frequent and lengthy furloughs. So who were they? Well, first of all, this is just an impetus for this whole project is creating a database of every soldier that served in Sonoma, based on their regiment when they were here, anything from their enlistment, hair color, eyes, skin, occupation, and goes much larger than this. This is just a snapshot, looking at trying to figure out who they were before they were in the Army, what was their experience during the Army, and what happened to them after the Army. Just trying to see, what influence did Sonoma or California have on them, and it's always vice versa as well. So at time of enlistment, this is who they were. But one of the interesting things, if you notice, that foreign-born was 51% of all the soldiers, of all the enlisted soldiers that served in Sonoma during 1849 to 1851. This is much higher than the standard, which was closer to 35%. There's no particular reason. This is just serendipitous, but that's how it is. So at the average age of enlistment, if they were American-born, they were 22.5. Foreign was a little bit older, 24.4. Origin is what they express as their origin, which was, we're assuming it's their birthplace. New York, Pennsylvania, and Ohio are the top 3 for American-born. And to be expected for foreign-born, it was Ireland and Germany, because throughout the early 1840s, we had the potato famine, and Germany was rocked by protests, economic crises, religious persecution, and they were the second largest immigrant group coming to the U.S. So that matches up. The average height was 5 feet 7.7 inches and 5 feet 6.6 inches. I think I don't think there's any things. One can't draw any conclusion about the inch difference between the two. But the mounted soldiers, there was a preference to have them be smaller, because if they were, then the horse itself would have less stress, could go further, and so forth and so on. So you may see this as like, well, they were kind of small. So like, well, they intentionally preferred to have smaller soldiers. And the occupations were, for that time, defined as unskilled or low-skilled, were the predominant occupations at the time of enlistment. We don't know if they were employed or not. All likelihood is they probably were not for most of them. So just very briefly about desertions. So most desertions did not actually occur at Sonoma. Some did, but these were mounted troops. They would go out on expeditions, patrols, so forth. So that's when they deserted, according to the records. But of those deserted, all native-born who were posted at Sonoma at some point, 26% of them deserted. And with foreign-born, it was 43%. So as I mentioned earlier, the standard annual desertion rate for the Army at this time was about 16% So these numbers are a lot higher. But you would expect that because the 15.5, 16% was for the Army over the entire country. These soldiers were posted in California near the gold. So you'd expect that. Of those who deserted, native-born 65% were apprehended, whereas foreign-born, it was 80%. So the average time served before deserting. So what this means is when they actually, first time they enlisted, at what point did they, into their service, did they desert? And it was for native-born, it was 2.8 years and foreign-born 1.4. So they attempted it much quicker. And these numbers also reflect the first time they deserted. There are examples, or there are some soldiers that deserted twice, and there was one soldier that deserted 3 times. So regarding the 1st Dragoons, so the 1st Dragoons was commanded by Brigadier General Stephen W. Kearny. In 1845, Kearny led a 2,000-mile reconnaissance of the Rocky Mountains and the South Pass. So the South Pass is an important feature, topographical feature. It's about a 20-mile sort of bowl or like saddle that is a pass between into the Rocky Mountains. So the western trails that were heading west would go through the South Pass, and then after that, they would split off into the Oregon Trail, the Mormon Trail, the California Trail, so forth and so on. So he led this reconnaissance, and it was 2,000 miles. So this is just a mind blower. Imagine 2,000 miles on a horse. It's really quite incredible. But there's more to come. So in 1846, when the Mexican-American War broke out, Kearny was given command of the Army of the West. His mission was to take his army, which included Dragoons and the Mormon Battalion and some others, on a 2,000-mile march to San Diego. At about the halfway point, they would stop at Santa Fe, which is the capital of the northern Mexican province of New Mexico, capture that, and then continue to go to San Diego to help capture Southern California. Meanwhile, the 1st New York Volunteers was going around Cape Horn, and they would land in San Francisco and then spread out through California to conquer it if it was needed conquering. So this strategy was all to get California, which was all part of the Manifest Destiny. So he did capture Santa Fe, and that's about the halfway point, and installed a civilian government. A little bit after that, he headed towards San Diego. Along the way, he met up with a scout and messenger, and they informed him that hostilities in Southern California were gone. They ended. So he didn't need all these troops. So he decided to send a large number of troops back to Santa Fe, and he had about 120 Dragoons with him in Company C and Company K. And he was going to continue because that was his mission. So, about 35 miles outside of San Diego, Lieutenant Archibald Gillespie and Marines, a unit of Marines came and said, "Oh no, there's some California Lancers nearby, and there's going to likely be some sort of conflict, a battle." And so in December 1846, we see the Battle of San Pasqual, in which Kearny's Dragoons and the Marines fought about 100 California Lancers. So what's interesting about this battle, this was the largest battle in Alta California during the Mexican-American War. It also ended up being America's worst defeat based on casualties. And one of the reasons is that it was wet, so it can be rainy in California in December 1840, in December, which is the rainy season. And so it was kind of wet. It had been raining the day before. And the Marines and the Dragoons used rifle or carbines and rifles that used black powder as well as the pistols. And black powder does not do well in wet. This means that in order to be effective fighting, they had to get close using their sabers. But the Lancers had, long lances, so they were able to really create some significant damage and cause much higher number of casualties on the American side. Reinforcements did come from the Pacific Squadron, some that were posted outside of San Diego. They helped and they enabled Kearny to secure the field. So many people consider it a draw. If you look at the casualty, the Americans got beaten pretty badly. But at the end, the Americans held the field. A little bit after this, the combined force captured Los Angeles in January 1848. And then on January 13th, 1847, we had the Treaty of Cahuenga, which officially ended hostilities in Alta California. So they spent some time in Los Angeles, and then some of the Dragoons went up to San Francisco. And so on May 3rd, 1849, Company C came from Los Angeles and San Francisco to Sonoma. At that point, there were 35 soldiers. Some had been killed at the Battle of San Pasqual. Some had deserted. Some had their service had expired. So they were down to 35 soldiers from Company C. They were commanded by Captain Andrew J. Smith and Second Lieutenant George Stoneman. So this is what their uniforms look like. This was their forage uniforms, which are their work, duty, expedition, and so forth. And it was dark blue coats, forage caps, the blue pants. If you look at the soldier on the left holding the bugle, they had a slightly different uniform because they were considered, slightly different. A musician or the bugler had a different front. This was their dress, so they would use this on the dress parade, formal, but also guard duty. And they had the dark blue wool coat. And it had a very short tail, almost like a semi-coatee, and they had a shako-style hat. The uniform changed in 1851. It wasn't a popular change, and it didn't last that long. But what it did was, for the first time, create colors that coordinated with the type of unit. So the Dragoons had orange. So on the hat, they had an orange pom-pom, and the orange just above the visor, and then orange on the collar. The mounted rifles, same uniform, except instead of orange, they had green. So the enlisted stayed at the Sonoma barracks. So in the box, that's the barracks. To the right is what the old Mexican mission looked like. And to the left was Vallejo's home, the Casa Grande, which was part of the overall fortifications. This drawing was done in 1851 by George Gibbs. He was a geologist, and his brother, Alfred, was stationed at Sonoma. So officers for quarters, they stayed at the Fitch House. This is a picture of what the Fitch House looked like in the 1800s. They also, some rented room at Vallejo's home, Casa Grande. We know some rented private houses. There were not that many houses in Sonoma at that time, but some of them did rent private houses. There's the Union Hotel that they may have stayed at. The Sonoma House, we know that a couple soldiers that were stationed there stayed there. That's a picture of it on the bottom of the right. But the Sonoma House would change its name to the Blue Wing Inn. Now, my operational definition of officers staying here is they were officially posted here. We know that other officers like William Tecumseh Sherman, Ulysses Grant, other very famous officers came to Sonoma, but they were here either for a meeting or some event or court-martial duty, something along that line, so they weren't actually officially posted. So the social life for the enlisted, cards, gambling, and they drank way too much. But also the Bruners. So the Bruners lived in Sonoma, but they have an interesting backstory in that the Donner Party disaster. The two young Donner girls, Eliza and Georgia, their parents, the Donners, died. The two girls were brought to Sutter's Fort, present-day Sacramento. There they were adopted by the Bruners, and the Bruners moved to Sonoma, where the girls lived for 8 or 9 years or so, and they lived on what's now called Donner Avenue. And the Bruners had a dairy, and in later years, Eliza wrote a memoir in which she talks about some of the soldiers would come over, and they would just talk and hang out, play cards. So it was a very different atmosphere than the saloon for some of those that just weren't interested in that atmosphere. And they also purchased eggs and milk and cheese, and so it was an alternative. There were few major incidents in the records regarding the enlisted soldiers in Sonoma. There is an exception. There was one soldier named Private Samuel R. Church. He did try to kill 2 fellow soldiers from the steps of the Nine of Diamonds saloon. He also stole George H. Derby's horse, who I'll talk about in a little bit, and caused some other problems. Besides that, there were some, mostly internal. There was no record that I can find thus far that they caused any significant problems in town, except for Private Church. Officers were very segregated from the enlisted, and they had their own social life. They had their own officers' mess. The enlisted would eat at the barracks. The officers had their own mess, which is at the Ray House or the Ray Adobe on Spain Street. It's also here at the Ray House in which we saw the first Masonic temple in Sonoma, Temple Lodge number 14, which was officially started or chartered in May 1851. The worshipful master was George H. Derby, who spent a lot of time fixing it up, decorating it, getting it ready, and like I said, he was the worshipful master of Temple Lodge number 14 in 1851. So, typical days, as I mentioned, with the volunteers, they didn't do much. They may have had one drill, one roll call, but that was about it. They had Sunday dress parade, they had work duty, but it was very loose and not highly regimented. In contrast, the regular soldiers had numerous steps per day, or a bugle here, because each one of these were called with a bugle. So each one had its own unique call. When you heard this particular call, you would know what it was. And so one can only imagine that the locals would hear these bugle calls going on all day. So it's just a way to think about, well, what was it like to have the army here? For one thing, you'd hear bugle calls all day. So what was the economic impact? Well, housing, as I showed, officers would So what was the economic impact? Well, first of all, housing. So all those officers that rented at private and the hotels, rented rooms, that certainly was income generated for locals. They also purchased food. We know that they purchased dairy-type products from the Bruners, but they purchased other food as well to supplement and to feed the soldiers. They also had forage, so these were mounted units. At any one time, they had from 50 to 175 soldiers in the corral behind the barracks. So they had to purchase hay and oats to feed the horses. But during the sort of the late winter, early spring, when there's springtime, when there's plenty of grass naturally growing, the soldiers would bring the horses out of the corral in the morning as part of the duty call, bring them to the plains area just below town, and there they would feed all day. And then in the evening, prior to the evening, they would gather them up, bring them back, and put them back in the corral. So that must have been an incredible sight to see this many horses kind of herded down and then herded back. They also needed wood. So wood was used predominantly for fuel, for heating, for cooking, for heating water, for laundering the soldiers' uniforms. It was also civilian employment. We know that local teamsters were hired. There were a blacksmith. What's also interesting is each officer was allowed, they were given an additional fund source specifically to hire servants. So it's quite likely that some servants were hired. And if they couldn't get them, we know that occasionally a couple of the enlisted soldier would be assigned as an orderly, and they would get out of some of the worst duty and just be an orderly, which is sort of like a military servant for the officer. The saloons made money too. We have the Nine of Diamonds Club, the Sonoma House, which was to become the Blue Wing Inn, and the Union Hotel. There's others as well, but they made a brisk business, not just off the soldiers, but also the locals as well. But those were some of the primary forms of entertainment back then. So illness and disease. Up until about World War II, the number one killer of soldiers at all times, including during war, was not battle wounds. It was illness and disease. And part of that was just, medical technology. But one of the principal factors before that was that the belief was that disease was transmitted through something called miasma. So miasma is vapors, bad vapors or noxious vapors, that if you smell these, bad smells, that's where disease is. And this is one of the reasons why wetlands, or what they would call swamps, were viewed so negatively, because organic material in a wetland in water without the presence of oxygen gives off sulfur, sulfuric smells. And so that was considered, just breeding grounds for disease. So they were viewed very negatively, and so forth and so on. So that's the whole point, is it's really, if you smell it, that's how you're getting sick. And so in part because of that, because they didn't understand that it was actually germs, they had very poor sanitation. This wasn't restricted to soldiers. This was the civilian population as well, in which latrines were located in the back of the barracks, and soldiers would go use the latrines or would go wherever. Their water source was located way too close to the latrines, and in some instances perhaps down gradient. They would use the bathroom and not wash their hands because, you don't need to unless you really want to. They didn't bathe regularly. Now, the primary diseases affecting soldiers in California during this time was diarrhea, dysentery, severe constipation, and typhoid fever. And what do these all have in common? That they're from fecal contamination of food and water. So if you're going to the bathroom, not washing your hands, and then preparing food, or if the latrine is located too close to your drinking water source, you have all these problems. So according to the Army Medical Corps in California during this time, for soldiers, the disease cases was 1.87 to 1 per year. And what that means is, on an annual basis, every soldier would be diagnosed with a disease 1.87 times, which is pretty significant. But this was about normal. And the other thing about the soldiers that would be different from the civilian population is they were in tight quarters. So sometimes they didn't have that many soldiers at the barracks. Other times they would have over 100, 125 soldiers there. So it was very packed. And so you would have these, you could see where you would have these problems. There was no cases of cholera, which was the one of the most deadly disease. That was from fecal contamination of drinking water, where someone would have cholera and they would use the bathroom, and that fecal material or the would get into the drinking water and someone else would take it. So it was kind of this positive feedback or self-sustaining system. But there was no cases of that in Sonoma, and they were not that frequent in California. They were usually very localized, but when they happened, they were very deadly. So, continuing with miasma, I know it sounds like a leap here, but in 1850, official weather records were being kept in Sonoma for the first time. So you can go back and look at these old records. They would take temperature 4 times a day, precipitation, they would record wind velocity, wind direction, degree of overcast. And this was all under the U.S. Army Medical Corps. And the assistant surgeon of the post was the official, I guess, meteorologist. So the first National Weather Service in the United States was actually the Army Medical Corps. The reason is that there was this belief, they knew the topography, but because miasma was through vapors, and it was the transmission of disease, the pathway was through the air, then what does the weather have to do with it? What are the climatic conditions? So they were looking at these local climatic conditions or weather conditions, and then the incidence of disease, trying to find a correlation. And they never did because there is none. So there were a few major, there was, lots of patrols and minimal, minor expeditions. There was 3 big ones. One, 1849, they went out to punish some indigenous for killing an army officer who was an engineer near Sacramento. 1849 to 1850, there was the big expedition to Clear Lake. In 1851, there was indigenous conflict in Oregon where they emptied the garrison and went up there to address that. So that brings us to the Clear Lake Massacre. So it started in Big Valley Ranch, which is in present Kelseyville, California, right there today. So if you're just north of the edge of the town center, there's this memorial there, which was the site of the first adobe home in Lake County. And this was by Charles Stone and Andy Kelsey, who were the first white settlers in Lake County. Andy Kelsey, he had 2 brothers, but he was one of the original Bear Flaggers of the 33, which, the Bear Flag Revolt was an attempt to overthrow the government, the Mexican government of Alta California, back in June 1846. These 2 and the Kelsey brothers were despicable individuals. There's no other way to present it. They were well known for their notorious treatment of Pomo slaves. So during their ranching operation, they would lure local indigenous people from the Pomo tribe into the ranch, or they would just go out and kidnap them and enslave them to work on the ranch. And so there's numerous reports of torture, beatings, rape, murder, and starvation as a way to punish and control, and they were just sick individuals. So there's lots of, I say differing stories as what the triggering event, but the agreement is there was a small, 3 or 4 or 5 Pomos that did something at the ranch because they were slaves there, and they were concerned what was going to happen to them. So instead, they decided to kill Charles Stone and Andy Kelsey. They knew that there was going to be a problem with that. So they and other Pomo took refuge on Bonapoti, which is the Pomo term for Old Island. It's an island in Clear Lake. This is just showing a Google map. It doesn't look like an island now. It was back then, but it's filled in. And it's now called Bloody Island. So the other, Ben Kelsey, one of the Kelsey brothers, went to the army and told them that his brother and Charles Stone were murdered, and what are they going to do about it? So the army directed the 1st Dragoons in Sonoma, 23 of them, to find and punish the Pomo responsible for the killings. But it being December, it was muddy. That's during the rainy season. It was too difficult to go up there. And they learned that the Pomo were taking refuge on the island. They didn't have boats to get to the island, so they came back to Sonoma. In May 1850, there was a new strategy in which there was a combined force of infantry, artillery, and dragoons, in total of 75 that would return. The infantry were from Benicia Barracks, the artillery was from Monterey, and the dragoons were from Sonoma. And they were under the command of Captain Nathaniel Lyon. On the way up, they went to Lake County via Napa Valley, and they killed 35 Wapo near present-day Calistoga, even though they had nothing to do with the killing of Stone and Kelsey. But Lyon was working on a sort of this collective punishment demonstration. If we just kill them, they'll learn, so forth and so on. They got to Bonapoti, and the combined force of 75 attacked the Pomo on the island. So they did have 2 mountain howitzers, so they used cannon, artillery, rifles, carbines, sabers, pistols, so forth. The reports differ. It's anywhere from 60 to 100 of the Pomo were slaughtered on the island, as they had no place to go. And again, almost all of them, very few of them had anything to do with the killing, if any of them did. That brings us to the Russian River Massacre. So just 4 days later, on their return, instead of coming down through Napa Valley, they came down on the other side in south of present-day Ukiah. Captain Nathaniel Lyon ordered attack of indigenous, killing another 75 to 100. And again, they had nothing to do with the killing of Stone or Kelsey. This is a picture of Captain Nathaniel Lyon. Just as a side note, he did become a brigadier general in the Civil War on the Union side, and he was the first general on either side to be killed in the Civil War. Meanwhile, we have the Sonoma Gang. This is what they were called in the newspapers. The 2 Kelsey brothers and a small number of others went on a killing spree in Napa Valley. And the killing spree was against indigenous people. The gang was arrested and jailed, and they became California's Supreme Court's first action and to release them on bond. So this is interesting because when this happened, California was not a state yet. California became a state in September 1850. They had a constitutional convention. They had a Supreme Court, but it wasn't a state. And the problem is they had no jail. They didn't really have laws. They sort of did, and everything was in flux. So the decision was, we'll let them go on a $10,000 bond, which was a considerable sum back then. I should say that because there were no jails, they were imprisoned on a Navy warship. The thought was, we'll release them on bond, we'll figure this all out, and we'll put them on trial later on. But the Kelseys being Kelseys, they fled, and they founded the town of Arcata, which is in present-day Humboldt County, and they continued killings of local indigenous people. So Brevet Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Hooker, who was the Assistant Adjutant General of the Pacific Division in Sonoma. He noted in a report that the Army is no longer needed to protect settlers from the Indians. Instead, it's needed to protect Indians from settlers. So there was this growing, albeit a very minority viewpoint, that the indigenous were just being massacred. Well, they were, but that it was a problem. But it was federal government policy and would remain, and then it also became California state policy, basically to exterminate indigenous people. So the Pacific Division, otherwise known as the 3rd Division, its headquarters was in Sonoma at the Lee's Fitch House. They arrived in Sonoma on July 1849. So the house itself was built by Jacob Lees, and Fitch then bought it, and the Pacific Division was the first tenant of the new Fitch House. What's really interesting is they paid $400 a month in rent, which in 2024 dollars is $16,300. So it was unbelievably expensive. But this is 1849. Gold rush. Housing is a huge scarcity. Hooker had some additional work completed, had it fixed up a little bit for its new occupant, which was General Percifer Fraser Smith. And over time, he had 11 officers there. We don't know who else was there, in that when General Smith was ordered to come and become the new commander of the Pacific Division, like I mentioned earlier, they had servants. He had a number of servants. He was a general. And he got them to agree that upon arriving in San Francisco, they would stay with him for at least a year. Because anyone that was arriving in San Francisco those days typically would head to the gold fields as soon as they can. So he landed in San Francisco, and sure enough, all of the servants but one took off to the gold fields. So he may have hired some, not sure if they lived in the Fitch House. It's just not clear at this point. And the Pacific Division was in charge of administrating Oregon and California. Even though he was the supreme commander, he was not interested in being the military governor. And so he had Department 10, which was the unit with just responsibility over California, which was headquartered in Monterey. Was the commander of that department was the military governor of California. And they just did logistics, pay, assignments, so forth and so on. July 1851, the headquarters moved to Benicia. Benicia was being built, the new barracks and the arsenal. And what's interesting is the new commander was General Ethan Allen Hitchcock. One of his relative, I can't remember if it was uncle or grandfather, was Ethan Allen of the Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys revolutionary fame from Vermont. He decided that that Sonoma was not an appropriate place for the headquarters. It really was Benicia, which, if you're looking at from a strategic perspective, that makes perfect sense, because Benicia was right on the San Francisco Bay, and it was at the entrance to the gold fields and the Sacramento River. But he went to Benicia, but he allowed his soldiers to go to Benicia whenever they could, because the problem is there was no officers' quarters. And Benicia was about 30 miles away, which is a day's ride. In fact, Joseph Hooker, who was the assistant adjutant general, which was sort of the operations manager, the executive officer type function, he was still in Sonoma as of November 1851. So in January 1852, all the soldiers left that were still in Sonoma. They left for Benicia, and this was a permanent change in station, a PCS. The Army sold surplus items that were remaining in Sonoma. There's stories about even a couple years later, citizens were walking around with old uniforms, jacket uniforms, and they got blankets, leather goods, furniture, so forth and so on. So regarding officers posted in Sonoma between 1849 and 1851, there were 24 officers of various units. 11 officers were with the Pacific Division, and there were 4 assistant surgeons. And these individuals were commissioned officers. They were just in a different type of system. And many of these officers were notable. The first one, my favorite, is George H. Derby. He was stationed in Sonoma from 1850 to 1851. He was a topog, which was a topographical engineer. This was a different section from engineers. There was the civil engineers and the topogs. And the topographical engineers were the explorers. So Charles C. Fremont, he was topographical engineer and did the exploring and mapping and so forth. And Derby did this as well. He would go out and on specific missions, and I'll talk about a couple coming up, but he might go and be tasked to go and look at a particular area to see where the best place for a new army post would be. And so he would have to assess it, the geology, geography, water access, availability of local building materials, all these kind of aspects. The other important thing is he had to draw, because there was no field cameras at that point. There was no photography, field photography. So you had to be a good drawer. And that's why at West Point, drawing was a required course that all soldiers, cadets had to do. He was also a famous prankster, humorist, satirist, and caricaturist. But the interesting thing about Derby is his first love was the army. He loved being a topographical engineer. He loved the army. And so that was his first love. But from 1849 to 1851, he wrote newspaper articles under the pseudonym Squibob. And he would go to some of them were he would visit Benicia and then write about it. He did it in Sonoma, San Francisco, all over these places. So he was getting pretty famous in California for his articles. The other really interesting thing, like I mentioned, he loved the army. And I've actually been involved in writing many, many government reports over my years, and humor has no place in them. They're not funny at all. Derby viewed it quite differently. In his reports, you can see some humor, and I'm going to give you a couple examples. The humor was sometimes subtle or dry, but after he was done with his expedition, he would submit his report to his commander. The commander would move it up the chain for review and approval. Eventually it would be sent to the Washington, D.C.'s headquarters of the War Department. The Secretary of War would probably view it. The President may see it. Congress viewed it, and then Congress would order it to be printed. So it's amazing that his humor actually was in these reports. And I'm going to give you 2 examples. The first one, he's near the Sacramento area, looking at sort of the goldfield area. He was doing an exploration. And he says, on the 21st, 2 or 3 of my men declined proceeding on account of the day, it being Sunday. I had allowed them, while engaged on the survey at Bear Creek, to rest on this day. But as they were receiving very high wages for very small equivalent, I did not conceive it necessary to cease from traveling, particularly as I very much doubted their sincerity in the matter. I therefore informed them that I had not the slightest objection to halting on every Sunday, but as they would do nothing on that day, I should infallibly stop their pay on every occasion of this kind. Upon hearing this, their devotional feelings subsided with vast rapidity, and they professed themselves ready to proceed. The second one is a very short piece where he's looking at a potential location for a new army post. And he says, I can conceive of no advantage to be derived from establishing a post in the vicinity. There would be no inhabitants to protect, and nothing, in fact, to protect them from. And unless engaged in a war of extermination upon the coyotes, the lives of the garrison would pass away in inglorious idleness. So, like I said, it's just amazing. He got away with putting humor in these official reports. He was court-martialed in 1851. As I mentioned earlier, this nefarious private Samuel Church stole Derby's horse, Derby felt kind of bad in that he thought that Church would be executed, so he let him go. And he was brought up under charges by Joseph Hooker for letting a prisoner escape. He was totally guilty, but they couldn't prove it in court. It's actually a really long, detailed, fascinating case that I'm working on a separate book project on that. But he was found not guilty of the serious charges, found guilty of some lesser charges, and he was let go with a reprimand. He then transferred to San Diego, and his new pseudonym was John Phoenix. I think he was reborn. What's interesting is he became probably the most famous humorist in the nation in the 1850s. And this was before Bret Harte and Mark Twain. And the couple differences, those two individuals, they did short stories and books, but Derby loved the Army. So he did articles and, basically letters and stuff like that. So someone put together all of his articles that had been published and published in a book called Phoenixiana, and it was a big seller in the U.S. In fact, Abraham Lincoln was a big fan. There's some stories that discuss that he liked, and if you know anything about Lincoln's sense of humor, they were right on track, kind of this droll, dry sense of humor, that Lincoln would read excerpts from Derby's book at cabinet meetings. Derby did die in 1861 before the Civil War broke out. So I've confirmed 10 officers that served in Sonoma that would later become Civil War generals. So we have Joseph Hooker. He was in Sonoma from 1849, 1851, the Assistant Adjutant General of the Pacific Division. He was court-martialed in 1851 because he got tangled up with Derby. They both issued charges, and they both got court-martialed in a simultaneous court-martial. Hooker was court-martialed for profiteering off the Army as he was buying hay locally, passing himself as an agent for the Army, and then turning around and selling it to the Army at really inflated prices. He did this with stoves. He did quite well financially. He was found not guilty by the court-martial. The reason is that technically it was not against Army regulations to profiteer against the Army. Following Hooker's court-martial, that regulation was changed quickly. He resigned his commission in 1853. He went between the court-martial and 1853. He was on extended leave of absence, stayed in Sonoma, and then he resigned because he was ordered to go back to Washington. At this point, he didn't want to, so he stayed and settled in Sonoma. He just became a farmer, rancher. People generally liked him. He hung out at the Blue Wing Inn, liked to gamble, play cards. Generally a well-liked individual. During the Civil War, he became a major general. He was the commander of the Army of the Potomac, the largest army within the Union Army, in 1863, following the disastrous defeat at Fredericksburg under the command of Ambrose Burnside. But Hooker only commanded from one battle, and this was the Battle of Chancellorsville, which is considered Robert E. Lee's greatest victory, and it was a stinging defeat for the Union and Hooker resigned his command of the Army of the Potomac. He did some fighting, and then later in the war served in a post, I believe it was in Minnesota someplace, and that was kind of the quiet end of his Army career. But he's still there's still landmarks because of his time here in Sonoma Valley. His ranch was called Agua Caliente. There's Hooker Falls. We have Hooker Creek, Hooker Bridge, which goes over Highway 12. And there's also a memorial to Hooker that you can see, which is right at the entrance of the current day Ceres Ranch, right outside their gates there. We have Alfred Gibbs. As I mentioned, his brother George is the one that did the most accurate depiction of the Sonoma Barracks in 1851. He was a brevet captain of the Pacific Division. During the Civil War, he was a brigadier general. He had field command of numerous battles, and I'm just picking out some various highlights that might be interesting. He was present at Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse in 1865, which was pretty much the end, but not quite, of the Civil War. George Stoneman, 2nd Lieutenant, 1st Dragoons. During the Civil War, he was a brigadier general. He commanded the 3rd Corps. It was anywhere from 10 to 20,000 soldiers, depending on duty status, so forth and so on. But a corps is one step below an army. So the Army of the Potomac would have a corps, and then division, battalion, regiment, company, so forth. So it was a pretty significant command. He returned and became governor of California in 1883. Philip Kearny, he was a captain in the 1st Dragoons. He was a very interesting individual in that when he was very young, he inherited something like $1 million. He was just incredibly wealthy, but he didn't want to live that life. He wanted to join the army, and that's what he did. The Mexican-American War, he got shot in his left arm, and he got amputated. And so he learned to ride his horse with his teeth, which is just mind-boggling that you could do that, because these were not necessarily gentle horses. These are, he's a cavalry officer. And that enabled him to use his right hand for pistol, sword, or whatever. During the Civil War, he was a major general. He was a very successful field commander, but he was killed in 1862, and Kearny, New Jersey is named after his honor, or in his honor. John W. Davidson, he was a 1st Lieutenant in the 1st Dragoons. He became a major general during the Civil War. Again, another successful commander of many battles. He got the nickname Blackjack because after the Civil War, he commanded a unit of the Buffalo Soldiers, which was an all-black army unit, cavalry unit. Andrew J. Smith, he was probably the longest-serving commander at Sonoma. He was captain in the 1st Dragoons. During the Civil War, he was a brigadier general. He commanded the 16th Corps, and again, another really large corps. He won the Battle of Tupelo in 1864. It may be not the most well-known war, but what's interesting about it is one of the more successful Confederate commanders was Nathan Bedford Forrest. But on this one, Smith beat Nathan Bedford Forrest in the Battle of Tupelo. Nathan Bedford Forrest would go on after the Civil War, and he's or one of the founders of the Ku Klux Klan. Alfred Pleasanton, he was the 2nd Lieutenant of the 2nd Dragoons. Civil War became a major general, and he was the commander of the cavalry in the Army of the Potomac. The cavalry in the Union Army in the beginning was considered far inferior to the Confederate cavalry, but he managed to turn things around, and he was commander of the cavalry at the Battle of Brandy Station, which is just outside of Culpeper, Virginia, Northern Virginia. And that, at the time, that was the largest all-cavalry engagement of the Civil War. And then he was the commander at the Battle of Mine Creek, which was the 2nd largest cavalry engagement of the Civil War. Horatio Gibson, he was a 1st Lieutenant, 3rd Artillery. He was a brigadier general. He was involved in artillery, involved somewhat in the defenses of Washington, D.C. He died in 1924. He was the last surviving Mexican-American War officer. We also have John G. Walker. He was a captain of mounted rifles. In 1861, he resigned his commission and joined the Confederacy. He was one of the few officers that had ever served in Sonoma that went for the Confederacy. He became a major general, and he led his own regiment, the Walker's Greyhounds, in Texas. We have Hiram Leonard. He was a major in the Pacific Division. He also was a master mason in Sonoma, 1851. He was a brigadier general during the Civil War, and he was the provost marshal of San Francisco because martial law was imposed. He became the U.S. Army's deputy paymaster in 1863, and shortly after that, he returned back to California to serve in the Pacific Division. Now, there's four former Sonoma Post commanders that are different. I just wanted to talk about them because they didn't serve during 1849, 1851. They actually served in 1846, 1847. This is actually before the first New York Volunteers arrived. And this is right after the Bear Flag Revolt and when the Mexican-American War broke out. What's interesting is all four of these post commanders were with the Navy because there was no Army here, but the Navy was there. So they would bring a detachment of Marines or Blue Jacket sailors with them to garrison the Sonoma barracks for various periods. So we have Joseph Warren Revere. He was the grandson of Paul Revere. He's the one that also took down the Bear Flag and raised the Stars and Stripes in July 1846. He was the commander of Sonoma in July, and then part of July, and then August through September in 1846. So in the Civil War, he was a brigadier general in the Army. So he resigned his commission, and when the Civil War broke out, he contacted the Navy Department to see if he could get a position. And they said, yeah, there's no slots available for you. So he became a brigadier general ultimately in the Army. He fought in the Peninsula Campaign in the Second Bull Run. He had a rather, I guess I would say, sad ending of his military career. He was a field commander during the Battle of Chancellorsville, again, which was Robert E. Lee's greatest victory, and it was a fiasco for the Union Army. And there was a blame game going around to, basically put the blame on some of the field commanders. Revere was one of them. He, I believe he was court-martialed. Abraham Lincoln stepped in, gave him, let him get out of it, and allowed him to resign. John Misroon, Navy lieutenant, he was commander October through November 1846. And later he was a commander of the USS Wachusett and the USS Savannah. William Maury, he was a commander in November 1846. He joined the Confederate Navy, and he commanded the CSS Georgia. And the CSS Georgia was a merchant raider, which was a legal and encouraged pirate. Finally, we have George Harrison. He's the only one we don't have I can't find a likeness for. He was commander in March 1847, just before the New York Volunteers came there. He also joined the Confederate Navy, commanded the CSS Jamestown and the CSS Morgan. What's interesting about Harrison, there's not much known about him, but as soon as he arrived in Sonoma in March 1847, he purchased a lot in town, indicating potentially that he thought he could settle there, or it was too early to be land speculating, but it's possible. And then later on, he bought another lot. So obviously, Sonoma had an impression on him. So definitely the regular army, I think I established that the regular army was needed in California because there was no government. There was an increasing population. There was increased conflict with indigenous people, fear of an invasion with the British and French. And it wasn't a state. It was just this weird kind of in-between status. And so because there was no government, the army stepped in to fill that vacuum. But the Army did have economic benefits to Sonoma, from housing, civilian employment, purchasing local goods and services, and so forth. They did participate in some indigenous massacres, but that was federal policy, thus Army policy, and ultimately would be the state of California policy in its early days. And finally, there was multiple officers that served in Sonoma that would become famous during the Civil War, which in itself is just fascinating that this one place saw so many individuals. And there were other, General, Ulysses S. Grant, William T. Sherman. They were in Sonoma for some duty. They were not officially posted there, but it's just fascinating. And this is just, you can put this on pause if you like. This is just a list of all the enlisted that I've been able to verify actually were posted in Sonoma between 1849 and 1850. And these are the officers posted in Sonoma in between 1849 and 1850. If you have any historical leads, records or anything like that that you'd like to contribute or let me know about for this project, that'd be great. Or if you have any questions about this, here's my email. And thank you for listening.